So what I want to talk to you guys about is the concept of frequens modus and the commentary tradition, Aristotelian physics, and the 5 words of Liechtenauer. So the phrase frequens modus appears as a Latin phrase inside an otherwise Middle High German treatise of the Codex 3227a. So the question we could ask ourselves is, why is this phrase in Latin when the rest of it is in Middle High German? The only other Latin phrase is a misquotation of Aristotle. So it seems clear that that it's at least possible that the author of 3227a is trying to get us to think along those terms, that choosing Latin means that it's a technical term that's meant to be understood in terms of Aristotle. So I'm going to try to make the case that modus should be understood in the context of medieval philosophy and Aristotelian physics and how they understood it. And I'm going to try and broaden our idea of modus from motion to change more broadly. And I'm going to use the concept of the 5 words to demonstrate that. Are you guys familiar with the 5 words? If I say that, is that? So the 5 words in Liechtenauer are strong, weak, before, after, and indes. So there's a fundamental principle of KDF, of Liechtenauer fencing, that we fence according to strong, weak, before, after, and then he says indes, mark that word. And what I'm going to try and say is that feeling is the perception of the modus. The modus is the change, strong and weak, that occurs before and after, that creates time, indes, within which you're intended to work. Okay? So after we go through modus, I want to talk about frequens and what the word frequens meant in the context of Aristotle and Aristotelian physics. Okay, any questions on that? That's basically the line. So the methodology I'm going to use is something called source-based contextualism. Basically, all that means is that in order to understand what somebody's saying, it's helpful to understand who they're responding to and who they're talking to. So I'm going to not just be going through Aristotle or through Aquinas as he understood Aristotle. I'm going to be tracing the history of these ideas back through the pre-Socratics, through Aristotle, and then through the Arabic-speaking tradition and into the Latin-speaking tradition, so to give you a kind of a broad scope of what these people were trying, what the problems these people were trying to solve were, and how these answers to these questions developed over time. As far as my interpretation of the 5 words, it's based heavily on the work of James Riley, and forgive me if I mispronounce his first name, but Maciej Talaga? Maciej? Okay. Maciej Talaga. Particularly, Riley understands strength as fundamentally alignment. He gets that from the Zornhaus section when it says lay your sword on strongly in the Zornhaus section. He matches that with laying on the strong edge in a way that you're fundamentally aligned. That makes you strong. Talaga has something similar. He hasn't related that to the 5 words yet, but he distinguishes between winding and wending. And wending is tracking the person's motion with the long edge. So this is where I'm coming from as far as what do I mean when I say strong. I mean fundamentally alignment. So it's a quality of the person's fencing where they're aligned in the direction of the opposing force such that it makes them strong. Okay, as opposed to pressing and other things. Yeah, I could go further into the history of that idea, but that's another talk. So as far as the commentary tradition is concerned, I mentioned already we have a Latin phrase that occurs in a Middle High German text. So a question that we could ask is, who's the intended audience of this text, given that it's written in these 2 languages? So the Middle High German suggests that it's for a German-speaking audience, probably a literate German-speaking audience. In this case, since it's a house book, it's probably for that particular house. But we have a larger commentary tradition of Liechtenauer where it's written in Middle High German. So what that gives you is that gives you a certain kind of audience, where the audience is broad in one sense because it's anybody who speaks Middle High German, which is, you know, your native language of the area. But it's also narrow in another sense because it limits it only to people who speak Middle High German, so Italians can't read it. On the contrary, we're using this phrase frequens modus, which is a Latin phrase. And a Latin phrase suggests another kind of education. So you could have an educated group, but it's an international group. So in that sense, you have a broad audience in that it's international, but you have a narrow audience in that they have to be educated in Latin, in the Latin tradition, right? So here we have this confluence of these two traditions that suggest that it's tapping in on the kind of people who understand both. Yeah, so I mentioned that 3227a, the Codex 3227a, is a house book, so that makes it unique among the commentaries on Liechtenauer. That's fine as far as I'm concerned because commentaries are, in both the Latin tradition and in the Middle High German tradition, as I understand it, are meant to be read aloud, and then you take notes on them. So they're lectures. A lecture means reading. So they would read from the commentary, and then the person would write it. So it's very possible that the author of 3227a, whoever he was recording what he remembers from lectures so that they can be part of the common knowledge of the house, if that makes sense. So it's similar but different in that regard. And I'm also going to be tapping into the commentary traditions on Aristotle. Specifically, I'm going to use Thomas Aquinas, not only because he's very readily available, but also because the author of 3227a quotes Bonaventure. He misquotes Aristotle. He says it's Aristotle. It's actually Bonaventure. Bonaventure is a contemporary of Aquinas, but he never wrote a commentary on the physics. So Aquinas is a contemporary who actually wrote a commentary on the physics. Aquinas and his teacher, Albert, are responsible for bringing Aristotelian physics in from the Arabic-speaking world into the Latin-speaking world. So I guess any questions on commentary tradition before we go on? So then I'd like to kind of go through the history of modus, and then the text, the history, a little bit on frequens, so that we have we can bring those two things together. So what is a modus, and then what makes a modus frequens? In order to do that, I'm going to trace through several key figures from the Greek-speaking tradition. Mostly they're known as the pre-Socratics, but then also into Plato and Aristotle. So some context for Greek thought. Pythagoras, very early on, had the insight that was key to Greek mathematics. So there were math traditions in the ancient world that were really advanced, particularly in Egypt and Babylon. They were very advanced, but they were based in real-world application. So their math tended to be numbers that represented measurements, that represented real objects. And to us, that sounds great because they're real efficient engineers, right? Practical application of mathematics. But it limited them. And the insight that the Greeks had was if you consider the object independent from the physical object and just as a picture in your mind as definitions, that abstraction frees you up to have different insights than you would have if you were limited to just practical application. So you can understand what a square is in terms of angles and sides in a different but very intricate and detailed way if you stop measuring squares and stop measuring angles and just consider what are points and lines and surfaces in abstraction. So that the fact of abstraction was a huge advancement in the history of philosophy of science. So it's in that context that we're talking about Greek thought and change and motion. So I want to back us away from the idea that modus means motion and encourage us to think of modus in broader terms of change. And so the problem that the Greek-speaking world wanted to solve was how do you explain that the same thing can be different across time. Because there's a fundamental tension, right? They're opposites. Something is the same and something is different. Those two things are contradictory. And you might think, well, that's easy. You just explain it according to time. It was this way, and now it's this way. And so you explain change in using time. The problem that I think the Greek-speaking world had was that if you explain change in terms of time, you then have to explain time. And time is a measure before and after of a change. So let's do a little thought experiment. How would you know how much time had passed if nothing changed? You couldn't rely on your breathing. You couldn't rely on your heartbeat. There was no sunrise and sunset. How could you tell if any time had passed? Right? In other words, we mark time using change. So to explain change according to time is to explain change according to change. It becomes a big circle, right? It's called begging the question. It doesn't explain anything. Does that make sense? So we have to explain change in a way that isn't dependent on time. All right? So that we can get time back later. And again, that's going to be relevant because of indes. So the first figure we're going to start with is the earliest pre-Socratic. His name is Thales, and he had this theory that he said everything is water. So pre-Socratics are interesting because they're difficult to interpret because of two extremes. On the one hand, we don't have any of their written work, so we have to interpret them based on what other people said about them. That means that when we interpret someone like Thales, we have to rely on Aristotle, what Aristotle said about Thales. But for Aristotle, Thales is a precursor to Aristotle. So it's hard for academic philosophers to interpret Thales in his own words and in his own thought and not just inject a bunch of Aristotle. Like Thales is warmed over Aristotle, right? He's just Aristotle but bad, right? It's hard to avoid doing that. So what academic philosophy has done is they've gone, in my estimation, I'll say this here because we're more interested in swords, in my estimation, too far the other way, and tried to explain the pre-Socratics without context. So you take the phrase, everything is water, and you pull it out of Aristotle, and you put it up in the air, and you think, well, what could that possibly mean, everything is water? And what happens then is that they start to sound ridiculous, right? So I want to try and navigate a mean, like a path between these two extremes, because these people are trying to solve something, and they're doing it in a very subtle way. And so they're not ridiculous, but also they're intelligent in their own regard, and so they're not just precursors to Aristotle. So what does the claim that everything is water mean? So Aristotle gives us this phrase in the context of trying to explain generation and corruption. So by generation and corruption, he means things coming into being and things passing away from being. Okay, so generation would be coming into being in a certain way, and corruption would be passing away from being. And what Thales wanted to answer is, what stays the same throughout that process? Right? What is the underlying substratum that is consistent over which things change? And that's why he came up with the idea that everything is water. So some possible explanations for that would be that water. Aristotle gives the example that because Aristotle was a biologist, he says, well, water is necessary to life, and it helps seeds grow from seeds to plants, and so maybe he thought that that fact explained why he chose water. Another explanation we might give is that water is seen in all three states of matter. It's seen in solid, liquid, and gas. And so maybe it's a good substance out of which you could make a table and air and a drink, right? It explains all three states. And since we're thinking from a chemistry perspective, it's also a solvent. It's something that you could use to dissolve things into their constituent parts, right? So again, Thales is trying to explain something very subtle, change before and after, that has something that remains, and he can't do it in terms of time, right? And he's not just warmed over Aristotle, and he's also not this ridiculous person going, oh, maybe everything is water, right? He's doing something. All right? So the next person that we'll look at is Heraclitus. Heraclitus was not a student of Thales, but he was a fan of Thales. He cites Thales as an influence. And he's got the same problem. What remains the same across change? And he doesn't want it to be any particular material thing. He wants to make it more abstract. Again, we're in the context of Greek thought, Greek mathematics. Abstraction out of the material is key to how we're going to make insights if we're thinking in terms of the Greek mind. So in the Cratylus, Plato gives us three different concepts around the word being that Plato is playing with. The first is ousia, that's the Greek word for being, and he says that it's possible that this word is derived from these two other words, esia and osia. So esia has to do with the goddess Hestia, the goddess of the hearth, and maybe what they're thinking is, that's the same goddess as the Roman goddess Vesta, so Vestal virgins, that sort of thing, if anybody's familiar with that. Hestia was a prominent goddess in Elia. Elia is the region where our next philosopher Parmenides is from. So Heraclitus is giving a nod to Parmenides by saying, well, maybe it's Esia. Or it could be that the word ousia comes from the word osia. Osia comes from a word that means something like force, something like push. So maybe there's an underlying force that underlies all being, and that is what is responsible for change. So say all that to say, we have this conversation that's going on between Heraclitus and Parmenides. And what Heraclitus is going to say is that everything changes and nothing remains the same. So there is no underlying substrata that we can tap into in this world. Everything is in constant flux. So his solution is something called the logos, which will be really important to Plato, that there's an underlying intelligible structure underneath the world that we can tap into so that we can understand it even though it keeps changing. Okay? So again, these guys are trying to solve this really difficult problem of change. And okay, so he says you never step into the same river twice. Before I move on to Parmenides, he says you never step into the same river twice. So he presents us a paradox. You have the same river, but you can never step into it twice because it's always different. The same river always has different water. It's always flowing in a slightly different path. So what justifies you calling it the same river if it's always changing? So people like to teach Heraclitus as though he was saying there was no constant, there was no intelligibility, everything's always in flux. I don't think that's quite right. I think he's presenting a paradox that things that seem the same also seem different. So what is that? And his solution is that there's an underlying intelligible structure. It's the phrase I use is it's an intelligible, articulable structure. So you can look at the river, you can understand the river, it's articulable, and then you can it's intelligible, and then you can start to articulate what it is you think you see. So you can say, I think this is a river. And what do I think a river is? Well, I think a river is a flowing body of water. So you have something that remains abstractly the same across the material differences. Okay? So that was a lot. Any questions up to this point? Okay, so going through the history of change, Motus, we had Thales trying to figure out an underlying material substratum. We have Heraclitus talking about everything is in flux, but now we're in the realm of abstract thought. Our next figure is Parmenides. So Parmenides says that, famously, that all is one, and there is no change. Okay? How do we make sense out of that, considering that we know that everything changes, right? So again, I think what he's doing is very subtle. Parmenides' insight is that being is and non-being is not. Okay, obvious, right? No. Being is and non-being is not. How do you go, again, without reference to time, how do you talk about something that is becoming something that is not? In order to do that, you have to say that something that is not. So being is not. Well, that's not right, right? You can't do that. You can't say being is not or non-being is. That doesn't make any sense. So that's Parmenides' insight. And so what you have to do is explain the world of change in terms of, that's in a way that's consistent with this insight, that being is and non-being is not. And the solution he comes to is there's two worlds. There's two worlds. There's the world of truth and being, and then there's the world that we live in, which is the world of change and opinion. And that's just it. So mathematical things can be true because they're abstracted and they're in a different realm. And things about the world, your opinions about things that change, can be true in a sense, but in a more limited sense, right? And that these ideas are still popular and discussed, and they still have a lot of purchase. So now along comes Socrates and Plato. And Plato is writing about Socrates. Socrates is interested in whether or not we can say things about human behavior that are as true as the mathematical things, whether or not we can tap into that, well, I don't want to jump the gun, but whether or not we can tap into that intelligible, articulable structure when we're talking about human behavior. Or if that's just like Parmenides would say, if it's just a matter of opinion. Right? Is there something it is to do right and wrong abstractly, or is it just opinion? Right? Socrates is obsessed with this question. Plato, his student, then inherits this dichotomy between Parmenides and Heraclitus, and is deeply influenced by both insights. The insight that it cannot be the case that being is not and non-being is. That cannot be right. But also, it's probably the case that there is something that is the intelligible, articulable structure of the world. Okay? So he comes with two solutions to the problem. The first is he equates the logos with the realm of being. So the intelligible, articulable structure of the world in this world participates in what Parmenides said was reserved for the other world. These two worlds touch somehow. Okay, and that justifies us saying true things about things that change. Okay, and the other is something called so that's the realm of the forms, if anybody has ever heard of that from a philosophy class or whatever. The other is something called the five genera. The five genera occur in the Sophist, and he's basically trying to answer the question, how do you talk about change without saying that non-being is and that being is not? And so he comes up with 5 categories for relating or for explaining change in terms of being alone, in terms of things that exist alone, so that he doesn't have to say non-being. So a thought experiment that we might do if this was a class, I'm going to spare you guys this, but a thought experiment that we might do if this was a class is try and explain something changing, but never use the phrase is not. Right? And the solution that Plato comes up with in the Sophist is he has being as a category, because being is. Non-being can't be a category. It can't be a thing that exists, because Parmenides. So being is, but being is something that experiences 2 additional categories of things that exist. Motion, here we go, now we're in modus. You were wondering where I was going with this, now we're in modus. Motion and rest. So being is the kind of thing that experiences motion and the kind of thing that experiences rest. So you can say the chair, when it changes, experiences motion. Or the classical example from Avicenna that we'll get to is if I was wearing a black shirt and we dyed it white, it would change from black to white, right? The blackness would corrupt and the whiteness would generate. But you have to explain the relationship between motion and rest. How does something change from motion to rest if motion cannot be not rest? Right? If you say motion is not rest, you're not talking about non-being. And Parmenides will come in and smack you, right? So he has to have two more categories. And the categories he comes up with is sameness and otherness. So motion is other than rest. Okay? Otherness can be a thing that exists, being different. And sameness can be a thing that exists, being the same. So you can say that motion is other than rest, and you can say that motion is the same as motion. You can say that motion is the same as being. You can say that rest is the same as being. And now you can start to, using these 5 categories, you can start to explain complicated phenomena, complicated change. Interesting that it's 5 categories, considering that what we're here to discuss is the 5 words of Liechtenauer. He's trying to explain fencing in terms of alignment, misalignment, so strong, weak, before, after, which is necessary for change. It has to be something before, it has to be something after. And then indes, the time within which, the time meanwhile, the change occurs. Okay? So it's interesting that the number 5 persists through these 2 problems. Right? Something about the number 5 explaining motion is important. Okay, so Plato. Any questions about that? I'm giving you guys like a really heavy crash course in philosophy. So like, seriously, are there any questions?
Yeah. So glad I watched your YouTube video. I'm so glad we're recording this one. So.
Oh man.
Yes.
Yeah. This might be I'm going to come back to that type of a type of a thing. Fair. Very fair.
Sorry, just
Yeah.
those 5 categories, right? There's the rest, promotion, same or other.
Yep.
And then the 5th is
Being.
being, right? And there's no such thing as non-being.
And there's no such thing as non-being, so it's not part of the categories.
So
Yep.
then these 4 categories are subcategories of being.
Yeah, they're things that are. Yep. So there's subcategories of being. Yeah, sure. Yep. So now we're finally into Aristotle. Unless there are any more questions. Sorry, I'm going to move on. So now we're finally into Aristotle. So now we're finally into the beginnings of the source material that's directly referenced in 3227a and directly referenced by the medievals. Although they also, like in Aquinas, Parmenides and Heraclitus, and the dichotomy between the two of them appears prominently. So I take it back. But Aristotle's insight is that there's still a problem with Plato's solution. And the problem with Plato's solution is the reference to the abstract realm of the forms. So when you understand something as changing, you understand the motion in the shirt from black to white, you think you're understanding the shirt. The shirt changed from black to white. But if Plato's right, then you're not understanding the shirt, you're understanding the logos, which is the form of the shirt in the realm of Parmenides' realm of abstract ideas. So Aristotle has a huge problem with that because that means you don't understand anything about the world. Right? So Aristotle's insight is you have to have intrinsic explanations to the things that are in the world. When I say the shirt changes, it has to be the shirt that's doing the changes, not the abstract realm of the forms. So Aristotle wants to put the logos, that intelligible, articulable structure, back into the thing that you're trying to understand. Okay? So that when we're understanding swordsmanship, we're not understanding abstract swordsmanship in the sky, we're understanding real humans with real swords. Right? So it's a necessary step to abstract in your swordsmanship too. Like, think about what you're doing and why you're doing it in the abstract. That's going to help you. But then also you have to pivot from the abstract back to the concrete and embody it, right? And that's going to give you new data that you're then going to abstract and pivot back into the realm of abstraction, think about it, and then pivot back into the concrete. Okay? But either way, it has to be real things that we're talking about. Okay?
That would be like you have a tactic, and you turn that into a technique, and then you abstract that technique back into a tactic.
Tactic and technique would both be abstractions in this case. It would be I have a tactic, and then I pick up a sword, right? And I try the tactic. That didn't work for some reason, or like, well, great success, yay. And then I go back to the drawing board. Okay, why didn't that work? Okay, well, maybe it was the tactic, maybe it was the technique under the tactic. Maybe I did it wrong. Maybe my foot was in the wrong spot. And so now we're in the realm of abstractions. And we say, okay, well, if my foot was in the wrong spot, what's the right spot? And then you pick up a sword again, and you change your feet. And now you're in the realm of the concrete. It's your actual foot that's actually changing, right? Then you pivot back, you get new data, pivot back into the abstraction, think about it, pivot back into the concrete. Does that process make some sense?
So it's sort of like, from a neurological learning perspective, right? We have an idea.
Yeah.
We have a hypothesis. We take an action. We reflect on that, right? Abstractly, that reflection becomes an observation that leads to an idea. We take an action.
Yep. Yeah, it's a slightly more general version of the scientific method. So it's applicable in everyday insights that where the scientific method isn't applicable. So you're absolutely right. Scientific method is sort of the paradigmatic example of that process. But you're using that every day, right? Like, does this taste good? Oh God, what the hell did I do this, right? And then you go back, try again. Okay. So what Aristotle comes up with as a solution. And now we're getting into the realm where things are going to start becoming relevant, and I'm just going to start using sword examples, thank goodness. The insight that he comes up with is that there's a third category of things between being and non-being that exists within the things that are, but only in potential. And so he differentiates between two different kinds of being, actual being and potential being. All right, and then there's non-being. So what is actual being? I am actually standing up. Right? What is potential being? I'm potentially sitting down. Right? I'm potentially doing almost an infinite number of things. Right? It's infinitesimal within a bound. There's nearly infinite things I could do while I'm standing up here. I'll avoid giving examples. But it's bound. And it's bound by what? It's bound by the kind of thing that I am, my intelligible, articulable structure. What kind of thing am I? Well, I'm a human being. So I can be standing. I'm actually standing. So that's something that is. I can be sitting. I'm not sitting, but I could be sitting. Right? I can't fly. I'm a human being. Right? So I have my actual existence, my potential existence, and my non-existence. I can't exist as a thing that flies. Okay? So the potential is virtually limitless, but it's bound by the kind of thing that you're doing. So now we can think about that in terms of swordsmanship. Your partner, your opponent, whatever context, has a nearly infinite number of things that they could do. Nearly infinite. Right? But there's a limiting principle that is the nature of what you're doing, which is swordsmanship in this example. Right? So they could, what? They could cut in, they could take an aligned angle, look for a position of dominance, they could perform any number of techniques, but they can't pull out a gun. Right? You can't do that. All right? So there's limits based on the nature of the thing that you're doing. All right? So how does that help us explain change? You can actualize the potential. You can limit the infinite possibilities to one actuality. Right? So it's possible that your opponent will do any number of things, but they then have to actualize some possibility. Right? And the neat thing is you participate in that actualization. You can draw potential out of people as you're fencing them. Okay? So this is Aristotle's explanation of change. Change is the actualization of some kind of potential. So we're speaking about change very broadly. Aristotle in the Physics outlines 3 kinds of change. There is a 4th kind of change that he doesn't talk about in the Physics, and it's not relevant for us. It's substantial change. Substantial change is change in the underlying nature of the thing. So if I get eaten by a lion, my body goes from human being to lion, right? It changed what it is. As opposed to if I cut my hair, I go from a person with long hair to a person with short hair. I stay a person. In this case, it's the person that changes from person to lion. Did that make any sense? I feel like that was a silly example. So in regards to swords, it would be something like beating our swords into plowshares, right? Like we're just not doing it anymore. That would be a substantial change. So I don't think that that one is relevant, and it doesn't appear in the Physics anyway, so I'm concerned with the things that appear in the Physics. So the first kind of change is the paradigmatic change, the one that we think about when we hear frequens modus, which is change in place. You can move, right? So maybe frequens modus means move a lot, right? Move frequently, whatever frequently means. But I want to broaden this category because of the underlying Aristotelian physics into not just change in place, but the other 2, which are change in quantity and change in quality. And my specific example is going to be the change in quality from alignment and misalignment, strong and weak. Okay? So change, strong and weak, from strong to weak and weak to strong, before and after. He was strong and now he's weak. He was aligned and now he's misaligned. That creates indes, moments within which you can work, right? So if you're following along in the slides, I know that that's a complication, but that's okay. I offer an explanation from Avicenna. Avicenna uses the example of a black robe. That's why I've been using black shirt as the example throughout this presentation. He says clearly there must be 3 things present. Something which is susceptible to both what it was and what it will be. So in this case, you have in his example, you have the underlying robe or shirt, right? You have to have something that presently is, which is the shirt as black shirt, and something which could be the case. The potential has to be there, right? Shirt as white shirt if you bleach the shirt, right? So if you want, start relating it to fencing and alignment. You have somebody which is fencing you, somebody who is, let's say, misaligned, and somebody who you could provoke to take an angle of alignment down a certain side so that you can take advantage of that new angle, something like that, right? So as you're fencing, you consider the things that you have, your techniques, what you know, but you also consider the things that your opponent has. What are the potentials that I could actualize out of you? Are you the sort of person that if I provoke you, knows how to align themselves properly or not, right? If you try and provoke a strong parry out of somebody who doesn't know what a strong parry is, you're wasting your time, right? It depends on what you know, what you have actualized, and your ability to actualize the potential in the other person. So if you're provoking, think, does this person meet all 3 categories? Are they fencing? Check. Are they in some kind of mode, right? In this case, quality. Are they aligned or misaligned? Check. Do they know how to align themselves? Right? If I'm hoping to provoke them into plow, do they know what plow is? Do they have a good plow? Can I just plow through their plow? Right? Because if I can just plow through their plow, I'm not even going to bother provoking their plow. I'm just going to plow through it. Right? It's not. I wouldn't bother working around it, is what I should say. Right? Like if I'm thinking, oh, they're going to block on my right, their left, right? And so I'm going to have to come over to the other side, index their block, right? Well, if they can't block, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to provoke their crappy block, and then I'm just going to go through it, right? There's no point in going around it. So your fencing, in terms of modus, is also dependent on the potential of the other fencer. Does that make sense? Okay. And then Avicenna differentiates between two different kinds of existence, again, in this case. A quality that has a positive existence and a quality that has a kind of what he calls a privation. So a privation is something that should be there but isn't. And a quality is something that should be there but is. And then again, you have non-being, right? So the classic example of this, and so forgive the example, this is just a classic example, is a person that's blind. A person that's blind has the prerequisites for sight. So there are people that can see. There are people that are blind. They have the prerequisites for sight, but something's not working, right? So you think, well, a human is the kind of thing that can see, but this one can't, right? So there's something going on there. And then you have a rock. You wouldn't say that a rock is blind. Rocks don't see. So you have seeing things, things that usually see, but in this case can't. And then you have things that can see. That's sort of the classic example of that. So he wants to differentiate between these two things. Things that exist and are there, and things that should be there but aren't. This is relevant when it comes to alignment and misalignment, because alignment has a positive existence. If you're aligned in a direction, then you're aligned in a direction. Misalignment has a kind of not negative existence, but like a dependent existence. It depends on the concept of alignment in order to exist. So I can say right now that I'm aligned in the direction of Brandon, right? I'm aligned in the direction of Brandon, right? And Brandon is misaligned. He's just sitting in a chair, right? Now I can say I'm misaligned in the direction of Brandon. Brandon came after me, he'd knock me back, right? So there's a way in which we are all misaligned right now, right? In terms of fencing, in terms of the 5 words, we're all weak. Strength requires a positive existence. Weakness does not. Weakness is just the state of absence of something that should be there. Did that make sense? And interestingly, vor and nach don't work that way. If you and I are just standing here, I'm not in the vor, right? I haven't seized any initiative or done anything, but I'm also not in the nach. Those two phenomena occur simultaneously. They're what's the word for that? Shoot. They're something like emergent phenomena. That's not the word, but they come together, right? If someone's in the vor, someone's in the nach. If someone's in the nach, someone's in the vor. And there are times when neither person is either. Usually that's like the classic example. That would be a double, right? Who is in the vor? No one. Who is in the nach? No one, right? Did 5 words fencing occur? I don't know, right? So weakness has a privative existence. Strength, vor, and nach do not. They've got positive existence. So you can differentiate between 2 kinds of change. The kinds of change that is a generation and the kinds of change that is a corruption, right? Any questions about that?
Just to reiterate, generation brings you into a positive existence, corruption brings you into a negative existence.
Yep. So you generate strength, but then that strength gets corrupted, right? I'm aligned, and then I become misaligned, right? I don't generate misalignment. I can draw misalignment out of people, but like, it's not generating a state of existence. It's generating a state of privation. I'm taking them from something that they want to be, which is aligned, and I'm making them something that they don't want to be, which is vulnerable, right? So as these thoughts are getting transferred, I want to kind of back up a little and think about, we started in the Greek-speaking world of ancient Greece, right? Commentary traditions interacting with one another. Then we moved subtly into the Arabic-speaking world, with Avicenna. And now what happens after that is the Arabic-speaking world starts to interact with the Latin-speaking world in the Middle Ages. So Aquinas and his teacher Albert start to take all of this Aristotle, particularly the natural philosophy, the physics and chemistry and all those the hard sciences. They take that and they start to order translations to be done out of Cordoba and into Paris. So Cordoba is Arabic speaking at this point, Paris is Latin speaking at this point. So a big translation project occurs. And they have to figure out what they think about all this new science. So if you wanted to meet the smartest person alive in the 10th century, 11th century, a good place to look would be the Arabic-speaking world, right? So these great scientists are now, their work is now entering the Latin-speaking milieu, and the Latin-speaking world has to figure out what to do with it. So there's a number of controversies that arise regarding change, particularly about this, the positive being versus negative being of change, or like, does change begin at the moment of the beginning, or does the change occur at the moment of the end? And like, what do you do with the time in the middle? There's a lot of like nitpicking about that kind of stuff. And if this were the Middle Ages, swordsmanship would have a lot to say about that, particularly talking about misalignment. Are they misaligned when they first start to become misaligned, or are they misaligned when they become all the way misaligned? It's like, well, when they first start, like that's your go moment. We have something to say about that problem. Luckily for us, we don't have to worry about that in terms of learning the 5 words and that sort of thing. It would all be the other direction. So we've got these 5 words. Now I want to relate, I want to use change in quality as this paradigmatic example of motion that is not local motion, right, in terms of strong and weak. Modern people want to make every form of motion into local motion. Alignment versus misalignment is a change in place. That's not quite right even in terms of fencing, because I could be aligned with somebody. Actually, Brandon, I'll use it. Can you set yourself up like in alignment with me, just real quick? Just from there is fine. So Brandon is aligned in my direction, right? He's ready to take on force he's ready to fight me from here, right? He's ready to take force from this direction. And now, I'm off camera, but now I'm to the side of Brandon. Is he aligned anymore? Did he move? No. So something changed qualitatively in Brandon without any change in his location in space, right? So I can operate according to the changes of quality without having to operate according to change in space explicitly, right? And this is also true of, like, you could abstract this to mental states. Right? If somebody is thinking and you catch them in the middle of thinking, right? They'll be like, oh man, I wasn't ready, I was in my head, right? You caught them in the change in the quality of their mental state, right? So I've gone through a lot of this already, if you're keeping up with the slides. But now we're at the point where we can finally figure out what's going on with time as the Greek and Arabic and finally Latin-speaking mind. The Latin-speaking mind, that's the audience of somebody who would understand what 3227a is talking about when he says modus. What would they think time was? And time, then, is this measure of change, modus, before and after, vor, nach. Okay? And then indes is an emergent quality. Indes rides on top of the change. You recognize that something changed. You recognize the time that time had passed because you see the state before and you see the state after. So time becomes an emergent property on change. Does that make sense? So you get the opportunity to act indes. If you're concerned with acting indes, mark that word, right? So if you're KDF, mark that word, right? That's what they say in the sources. We should be concerned with indes. then we should be concerned about the change before and after, and the ability to perceive that change, which we call what? Feeling, perception, right? Perception, the change before and after, in terms of, in this case, alignment and misalignment. Right? So feeling is the ability to perceive the alignment and misalignment, the change that occurs, and the time it takes that you can work within that change. All right? Okay. Another area that this works in is provoker, taker, hitter, but that's sort of another set of topics. Okay, so modus. Any final questions on modus? Yeah.
Sort of, I think.
Okay, that's fine.
So, you mentioned that you don't take action to reach a state of privation, but when you're talking about kind of fencing, 5 words fencing, and everything, sometimes you want to be weak and
Yeah. Okay.
a state of privation. So wouldn't that be like Genesis towards a state of privation?
Right.
When you're not eliciting it out of someone else, but you specifically want to be, weak in the bind or whatever, in order to, provide an opportunity for, provide an opportunity for your opponent or elicit something. So would that not be, would they think of it as Genesis of a state of privation, or would they think of it in some other way?
Yeah. So it would be a corruption, right? Because you're taking a state that should exist, strength, alignment, and you're making it into a state of privation, which is weakness, right? So they would think of that in terms of a corruption. But there's a tactical reason to do that. So corruption, in this case, is not a bad thing. The way that we think about corruption as like some things coming apart or whatever. It just means going from a state of alignment. In this case, going from a state of alignment to a state of misalignment to reestablish a state of alignment, right? Sure, yeah. Or like you said, hitters tend to be misaligned, right? Because you're extended very far this direction. It's very easy to push you off to the side. That's why takers exist. That's why blocking exists, because there's an inherent ability to be blocked, right? Yeah.
What would this theory say about deception, right? One could argue it's you're weakening the alignment.
Yeah.
In that example, but couldn't you also do things that as generating a deception because it's not necessarily a true misalignment, right? You're baiting your opponent.
Yeah, it would be a true misalignment because you are misaligned, right? Yeah. In the process of deception, if you're misaligning for the purpose of aligning later, then sure, it could be a deception. The interesting thing about deception from a 5 words physics modus standpoint is that it only works if you actualize the potential of the other person. It only works if the stuff you know touches the stuff they know, right? If I can get you to strengthen on my feint, we have a relationship now. I'm in the vor, you're in the knock. I'm the cause, you're the effect, right? I actualized your potential, right, to strengthen, right? And I can work indes. All these phenomena suddenly start to emerge. What happens if I feint and I don't actualize your potential? You don't block. Maybe you weaken also and you stab me back and we hit each other. Classic example of a double. Who was in the vor? Who was in the knock? Right? Kind of nobody, right? That relationship, that bind relationship of cause and effect, actuality and potentiality, that modus, that connection of modus as cause to effect has to be established in order for all of this stuff to start working, right? So a good feint establishes a relationship between the feinter and the feintee, right? Did that make sense? Somebody has to have a thought on that. I mean, a room full of fencers, somebody's got to be like, that doesn't make any sense, or like, that's great, or something. No, okay. This is a lot, so I don't blame you guys. I think you guys are doing great.
So to reduce this down to a simple fencing principle, is it about finding opportunities in moments of change when you or your opponent and another?
Yeah, it's about creating them. Yeah, it's about being the cause. So again, this is we're getting into the fencing and away from the Aristotle, but so this isn't what I came here to say, but that's how I think about the vor. Being the vor is being the cause. It's being the efficient cause of the change in the other person that creates the opportunity for you to act indes. Right?
Yeah, I get it. Our club does fiore, so I'm thinking about
Oh, sweet.
putting your point in line to get your opponent to disengage, to circle the point, which
Mm-hmm.
creates an opening for you. Is that being the cause of
Yep.
the change that gives you the opportunity
Yep.
to touch in the moment?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. But the problem is, you always find fencers who don't know to do that.
That's true, yeah.
They don't have the potential. So you can't actualize it. You can't be the efficient cause of the actualization of their potential.
And that's why fencing is hard.
And that's why fencing is hard. You can't just know yourself. You have to know your opponent as well. Yeah. Yeah.
That's why fencing newbies hard.
Exactly. That's exactly right.
No idea what they're going to do.
Exactly. Yeah, because you don't know what they're going to do, because they don't know what they're going to do. Yeah.
To your point on the feint, you would throw the feint to look for a strong, have your opponent's strength, and then you would weaken to come around.
Yeah, in that example, yeah. I mean, you could also try and provoke them into weakness too. Like you could, I mean, you just have to think of a different example. But yeah. Yes.
So you kind of touched really briefly on Humanities before.
Yeah.
In relation to this, can you kind of expand upon how you see it? Because the way you talk about it was actually a little bit I conceptualize food.
Oh, cool.
So
Yeah.
I'm very curious.
So you might think about it as the opposite of the double problem where I was talking about that relationship never occurred. There was nobody in the knock. There's nobody in the vor. Fooling is the ability to perceive whether or not that relationship has taken place and what the change is that's taken place, right? So this is the way I look at it as far as like the sources. The sources say indes, work indes. What does indes mean? Indes means in between the before and after states. What does that mean? That means change. That's modus, right? So what is fooling? Fooling is the ability to perceive indes. Did I see the opportunity? Was I able to perceive the opportunity? Did I detect the change? Could I work within the time frame of the change? Did I know the before state, and did I accurately perceive or predict the after state, right? So fooling is my ability to make change and act indes. My ability to perceive that. Does that make sense?
No, that makes a lot of sense.
Okay.
It's kind of interesting because I think like my conceptualization of that, most of that, I got in indes.
Yeah.
Versus, so
Yeah.
I was leaning most of that kind of action behavior into my conceptualization of indes versus my conceptualization.
Sure.
Fooling in my brain was more about the action
Okay.
alignment than it was.
Okay.
And indes is my way to recognize that.
Like fooling is about perceiving the current state
Yeah.
accurately as opposed to recognizing the change.
Yeah, I'd love to go through the particulars of that maybe later because it is very interesting because they're all descriptions of the same underlying phenomena, but from slightly different perspectives. So modus and frequens modus we'll hopefully discover by the end if we have time is not the same as indes. It can be the creation of moments of indes, but we'll discover it's about the change and the appropriateness of the change. So there are times when you don't act indes explicitly. A good example of that is the hue setting or the on setting. In a moment of stillness, when you have positional advantage, set on them. Well, are you acting indes a change? No, you're kind of initiating the change, right? So frequens modus, change, in that case, is change that is possibly establishing moments of indes, but it's independent of the concept of indes. So it becomes really interesting when those things particularize and you have to be able to differentiate between the different uses and their conceptions and their applications. So like, yeah, I'm looking forward to talking to you about this. No, you're good. You're good. Any other questions before we?
This is why we're here.
Yeah. Okay, so modus. What makes modus frequens? So I'm going to be relying on Aquinas. Again, I mentioned Aquinas, contemporary of Bonaventure, actually wrote on physics, deeply influenced by the pre-Socratics, by the Greek language philosophy, by Arabic language philosophy, embedded part of this tradition that's being invoked by 3227a. Also very popular. His works are numerous examples of surviving works of his. So plenty of spread, plenty of influence. So he's a good sort of baseline in this topic, right? Like we can use him as kind of our litmus test or our check. So in his commentary on the physics, he distinguishes between three qualities of being. Forget I said that. That was too complicated. Okay, so he differentiates between things that are always, things that are frequently, and things that are in the minority of cases. So the Latin he's using is semper, frequenter, and in pautioribus. So if you're following along the slides, that's where we're at in the slides. Things that are always a certain way, things that are frequently a certain way, and things that are sometimes a certain way in the minority of cases. Okay. I'm going to use frequently as the translation of frequens. That's a decision. Hopefully it's an okay decision. The translations of Aristotle use for the most part. So if you're actually reading the physics in translation from Aristotle, the phrase you'll come across is for the most part instead of frequently. That's also a decision. There are pros and cons, but since that's how it's translated in our community, frequens modus, we like move frequently or move a lot, something like that. I'm going to kind of use frequently, but like this is a technical term. I'm engaging a technical linguistic term. So again, if you're following the slides, I lay it out. There is the Greek words in Aristotle for always, for the most part, and then in the actual Greek text of Aristotle, all I could find was in tois, which is in these, or in the, and then whatever the adjective is implied. So I don't actually know what word he uses for a minority of cases. The Arabic philosophers in their translations assumed that he was talking about the minority of cases, and so they use a word explicitly that is not there in the original Greek. And then the Latin picks up on that for in pautioribus. But what we're mostly concerned with, fortunately, is the differentiation between these states of semper and these states of frequenter. What does it mean to be changing always? Or to be frequens modus, right? What does it mean to be changing often, or changing a lot, or changing frequently, or for the most part in the technical kind of Aristotelian sense? Okay? So the way we're going to understand frequens, is by understanding its contrast to always. And the examples from Aristotle and then consequently from Aquinas are interesting. He talks about human beings always being animals. Human beings are definitionally rational animals in the classical tradition, in the Greek, Arabic, Latin tradition, right? So if you're a human being, you have to be an animal. You don't have a choice, right? That has to be the case. You could have all sorts of different things that particularize you as the individual that you are. Animal is not one of them. You have to be an animal. I'm sorry, we're not angels. But he says human beings frequently have two eyes. Well, that's an odd example, because you could say that human beings are the kind of thing that has two eyes, right? the example that I use in, the example that I use when I'm teaching this to students is, and I apologize for this example too. The examples are always terrible, and I just apologize. Is how many legs does a cat have? So I'll subject you to this one. How many legs does a cat have?
On average?
Right, right, exactly. So a cat has 4 legs, right? Yes, yes, yes. A cat has 4 legs. A cat is the kind of thing that has 4 legs. It's a quadruped, right? Statistically speaking, does a cat have 4 legs? No, it's got some number, unfortunately less than 4, right? Accidents happen, accidents of birth, accidents of genetics, accidents in the wild, accidents in your home, that create the conditions such that some cats don't have 4 legs, right? So a cat is not definitionally the kind of thing that has 4 legs, but it is classically the kind of thing that has 4 legs. And it's not statistically the kind of thing that has 4 legs. So modern people, us, we want to differentiate. We want everything to be statistical, right? That's the tendency. The same way when we were talking about mathematics, we wanted everything to be practical application engineering mathematics. The Greeks were obsessed with abstract mathematics. It's the same thing here. We want our definitions to be statistical. When we talk about how many legs does a cat have, immediately someone says, statistically, on average, right? That's a different method of inquiry. It's a different way of asking and answering questions than the classical way. So the classical way would say, yeah, of course cats have 4 legs. They're quadrupeds. The statistical analysis, the one that we have a tendency to do, looks at it in terms of well, what's the average number of legs? All right? This is the distinction I want you guys to make in terms of frequens. Frequens is not a statistical average. Frequens is a classical concept, right? So he's not saying move a lot, change a statistically large number of times. He's not saying that. He's saying change frequens, right? Similar to how a cat has 4 legs. Change frequens. So change according to the nature of the thing that you are, or according to the nature of the project that you're underway, right? So you change according to the nature of, in this case, swordsmanship. The kinds of change you want to do are the kinds of change that are appropriate to accomplish your goal. Right? What are the goals of fencing, swordsmanship? What are the goals?
Hit and don't be hit.
Hit and don't be hit. Sure. Don't get hit, doubles are bad. Yeah, I invert them. Primary goal, don't get hit. Secondary goal, look good doing it. Right? I base that off of a silly conception of a duel, which is primary goal, survive. Secondary goal, keep your honor intact. Well, if I didn't want to get hit in fencing, one thing I could do is run away, and you'll never see me again, and I'll never get hit, right? But I don't want to just do that. I want to be a cool fencer, and I want to survive engagements and hit the other guy, right? That's what I want to do. So I want to not get hit and look good doing it. That's how I do it. So the difference between semper and frequenter, the difference between always and frequently in this context then, becomes if you're doing longsword, you're always using a longsword, right? Once you get rid of the longsword, you're doing something else, right? You're wrestling, or you're dancing, or you're doing rapier, or whatever. It is definitional to doing longsword that a longsword be present. Right? Does that make sense? So always longsword. Cats are always animals. Humans are always animals. Right? It is so then frequently we are not getting hit and hitting the other person. That's what we're trying to do. Right? That's the nature of the activity that we're engaged in. What are you doing? I'm trying not to get hit. I'm trying to hit the other person. That's what I'm doing. Right? Does that always happen? No, life gets in the way. When you pivot from the concrete to the abstract to the concrete, right? Life gets in the way. So I'm trying to hit the other person and not get hit. But, statistically speaking, right? When you go from those abstractions where cats have 4 legs to the concrete situations of the unfortunates of life, That's what's going on here. So when you're thinking about modus as being frequens, you're not thinking about modus in terms of statistically you should be changing a lot. Okay? You're thinking about modus in terms of I should be changing in a way that promotes the goal I'm trying to achieve. Right? So, I ran through all these slides. Give me 1 sec to catch up.
Are you keeping an eye on time?
Yeah, I think I got 10 minutes. Okay, so now we've got frequens modus together, right? And we've already started discussing goals, things that contextualize how your modus is to be frequens. Other goals, if you're in the KDF or Liechtenauer tradition, are provoker, taker, hitter. If you're a Meyer, if you include Meyer in the KDF tradition, that's a whole other thing. Nachreisen, Überlauf, Haussetz. I consider those to be goals. Some people consider them to be techniques, but you want to achieve Überlaufen, you want to work Nachreisen, you want to work the Haussetz. All that means in my conception, this is another thing that's debatable and all this stuff, so more conversation for later, but it means that the first thing I want to do is I want to establish a relationship where I'm aligned and you're misaligned. Right, first thing, I want positional advantage so that I can hit you and you can't hit me, because that keeps me safe. Right? Then second thing, I want to work within your change, either in the vor or in the knock. If I'm in the knock, I'm going to chase you Nachreisen. If I'm in the vor, I'm going to, and we've achieved a moment of stillness where I have positional advantage, I'm going to change frequens and set on you. So I'm not working indes. What I'm actually doing is creating moments of indes for the other person because I'm the one that changed. Right? And I'm setting on them with hues, right? I begin with an onset, maybe they set it aside, I zook into the hands and back out, something like that, right? Again, that's another topic that is also controversial, but you can start to think about what I'm trying to do with these examples isn't present my interpretation. What I'm trying to do is give you the idea of what are the kinds of goals that are sub-goals toward the ultimate goal of surviving and hitting the other person, right? What are the things I need to do along the way, right? I need to make sure that my feints establish those bind relationships, like we talked about earlier. I need to make sure that I have positional advantage and the other person is at disadvantage. Whatever it is that helps you get toward those things, right? So in my estimation, provoker, taker, hitter, and Überlaufen, Nachreisen, and Überlaufen, Haussetz are in that category of sub-goals. All right, but that's another talk. Yeah, in other words, change or move according to the nature or purpose of what you're doing, always or for the most part. Okay, and we can begin to see how this is not the same necessarily as indes. They're not identical. We can also see how this is definitely, in my conception, not the same as move around a lot. Right? Statistically, change in place. That is a much too limited interpretation of frequens modus, in my estimation, if this presentation is right. All right. And then if you're on the slides, I have a huge bibliography you can take a look at for additional resources. And otherwise, any final questions? Okay. Well, thank you very much.